Today we're going to talk about the second half of the Revolutionary War, both the crisis and the triumph of the new United States of America. Though independence had been declared in July of 1776, the reality of that independence looked very grim. The Continental Army was close to collapse by the fall and winter of 1776. They were low on supplies, morale was low, illnesses ran rampant throughout the camps, and so all that optimism from the Declaration and kind of the belief that there was going to be this new country was starting to fade. The reality was that it didn't look like the United States was going to win the war and become a new nation. So Americans looked for things to basically give them confidence and give them strength to continue on in this struggle. And that inspiration came in the form of a pamphlet written by none other than Thomas Paine. And he starts with a very powerful opening that tells Americans about the reasons for the conflict. And also, it tells Americans that it is going to be worth the struggle in the end. He starts with, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands now deserves the love and thanks of men and women. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, and yet we have the consolation with us that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. That what we obtain too cheaply, we esteem too lightly. 'Tis dearness only that gives everything its value." And so Thomas Paine is inspiring the colonists. Don't be summer soldiers. Don't be sunshine patriots. Don't only be in favor of independence in this struggle when things are going well. And this pamphlet is read to Washington's army. It's read in the colonies. And Americans have a renewed sense that they must endure through this time of crisis so that they can realize the hope of their new nation. And George Washington's army, outnumbered, starving, low on supplies, had recently crossed the Delaware River to put that river between them and the British Army. But Washington knows that he can't go on like this forever. So he proposes a bold plan that on Christmas Eve of 1776, the Continental Army is going to try a sneak attack. They're going to try to cross the Delaware River under the cover of night and attack a force of Hessian mercenaries to try and defeat the British and take their supplies, knowing that if they can do this, one, it'll be a great victory for morale, and two, they'll have the supplies they need to last through the winter. So on Christmas Day of 1776, in the early morning, George Washington and his Continental Army cross the Delaware River, and they attack this force of Hessians. This is the most famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. It's a very inspiring painting, though it's an incredibly inaccurate painting. And we can talk a little bit more about those inaccuracies in class. But the Battle of Trenton was a huge victory. It's a small battle, not involving a huge number of soldiers, but it's a very important battle. First off, the Continental Army finally defeated this force called the Hessians, who were considered the most professional soldiers in the world. It also boosts the American morale and belief that they can win after those devastating losses in New York. And the Continental Army wins another very small victory before the Army bunkers down for winter. But one thing is clear after the Battle of Trenton. The Continental Army will endure, and the war is going to continue into 1777. So before we dive back into the war, I just kind of want to tell you guys about a couple of the symbols of the war that you might see around. This is called the Gadsden flag, and it's the very famous "Don't Tread on Me." If you remember from Ben Franklin's political cartoon during the French and Indian War, this is actually the same symbol, the symbol of the snake. And so the Gadsden flag becomes a very popular symbol of the American Revolution. Even so much as finding its way onto publicity campaigns for things like U.S. soccer. So the idea of the snake and "Don't Tread on Me" as a symbol of the United States, still around today. Also, the Stars and Stripes, our American flag, is invented during this period of time. And so that symbol, that flag that we still live under today, it was invented during this Revolutionary War. And you may also know about the Liberty Bell, which was the bell that hung in Independence Hall where the Continental Congress met. When independence was declared, the bell was rung. And here's a picture of a very young Mr. Moeller standing with that Liberty Bell. But you'll see the Liberty Bell on a lot of things. It's one of the important symbols of the United States. So now that I've kind of tossed out a couple of symbols, let's get back to the war. So meanwhile, while all these battles are happening, over in Europe, American diplomats are trying to get France to come into the war, especially Ben Franklin, who is one of the most popular and well-known Americans in the world, and he goes personally to try to negotiate France's alliance. And the war is becoming unpopular in Britain, so we're moving from France now to Britain, because it's costing too much money, and it's costing too many lives, and the British public is starting to turn against this war. So while events are happening in the United States, big events are happening in Europe. They're going to determine the outcome of the war as well. And so here's a picture of the map. You can see kind of where all these battles happen. The Battle of Long Island in New York, then White Plains, Trenton, Princeton. You can kind of see that most of this war is happening in kind of the New Jersey and Pennsylvania areas. So in the spring of 1777, the British Army, realizing that support for the war is kind of decreasing at home, they make a bold move to try to basically end the war quickly in the spring of 1777. And they're going to attack the Continental Army at a place called Brandywine Creek, which was actually right near Philadelphia. So the city of Philadelphia is captured. The capital of the new colonies of the new United States was taken by the British. The Continental Congress managed to escape. They managed to run and avoid capture. So the Continental Congress stayed intact, and the government would still be governing the colonies. And so the British failed to destroy the Continental Army. Washington's army manages to escape once again to fight another day and drag out the war. So really this battle of Brandywine Creek, the British try to end the war in one fell swoop by trying to destroy the Continental Army and capturing the government, but they fail at both. And so the war drags on a little bit longer, giving the United States the advantage. Most major conflicts have a turning point, and the American Revolution has a very significant turning point that happens in 1777, and it is the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. So right now, get up, turn around wherever you're sitting, sit down, and know that Saratoga was the turning point of the Revolution. It was a massive colonial victory, and more importantly, it convinced the French that the war could be won. If you remember from the Civil War, basically the idea is that Britain doesn't come in because they don't think the war can be won. Saratoga is the battle that the Continental Army proves to the French that they can win. So now France is going to enter the war as an ally, giving the United States a huge advantage now in the war against Britain. But the real question here, the French are on their way, but the real question is, can Washington's army last long enough for the French reinforcements to arrive and for the continent and for the United States and France to win this war? And Washington's army is going to face its biggest test in the winter of 1777. They're going to camp at a place called Valley Forge. It's going to be an extremely cold winter, and the conditions are going to be very, very harsh. And in this winter alone, 2,500 men are going to die at Valley Forge. There's an extra zero there. It shouldn't be there. And the conditions are bitter cold. There's starvation. There's not enough supplies, not enough lodgings, not enough blankets, shoes, all these things. So the army is near collapse at Valley Forge once again. But the Continental Army is going to get a boost from an unlikely source. They're going to get help from Europe in the form of Marquis de Lafayette and Baron Friedrich von Steuben. And Lafayette and von Steuben come from France and Prussia respectively, and they were professional soldiers sent by their countries to train the Continental Army in military discipline and order. And they managed to turn this Continental Army into a professional fighting force. So the army that comes out of Valley Forge, though cold, hungry, and ill-supplied, is going to come out as a fighting machine, better trained and better equipped to win the war at hand. But while Washington's army is fighting in the north, there's another war raging in the southern colonies, in Virginia, in the Carolinas, in Georgia. And in this war, originally the British are going to win a series of very decisive victories. They're going to capture 3 of the biggest cities in the South: Savannah in Georgia, Charlestown in South Carolina, and Camden, South Carolina. The Southern Army doesn't have George Washington. They're not as well equipped, and they're not as well trained. But the British make a huge mistake by trying to subdue the Carolinas. Many in the Carolinas didn't really want to be involved in this war. They thought that it was Boston's war. They thought it was a war for the North. But British and Loyalist attempts to subdue the Carolinas with military force is going to create some very powerful enemies. And when the British try to subdue both the people living in kind of the farmlands as well as the Appalachian Mountains, the locals are going to organize a large militia, and they're actually going to destroy a large British army at a battle at a place called King's Mountain. So inadvertently, the British actually brought a powerful new ally into the war against them. They brought a powerful enemy, that is, into the war against them. So the fortunes of the Southern Army start to change after Nathaniel Greene gets put in charge. And Nathaniel Greene has a 2-part strategy. His first strategy is going to be, like Washington, to kind of gradually wear the British out in these battles. But then he also uses the militia, so not the regular soldiers, but the militia, to wage a guerrilla war against the British to lower the British morale. They're going to threaten and destroy supply lines. They're going to destroy roads. They're going to attack wagon trains. They're going to chop down trees to block roads and passages. And they're going to have hit-and-run type attacks utilizing sharpshooters and quick ambushes. And this is going to mean that the army in the South, for the British, can't go to the North to help in the war against George Washington. The most famous of these guerrillas is going to be Francis Marion. You guys may know him because he was played in a film by Mel Gibson called The Patriot. But Nathaniel Greene and his militia are going to succeed in preventing the British from controlling the roads and the countrysides of the South. And eventually, the British General Cornwallis is going to have to abandon a lot of their outposts in the Carolinas and simply try to capture the colony of Virginia. So why would Cornwallis want to take Virginia? It's because the war is coming to an end. The French are on their way, and the supply routes for the Continental Army all run through Virginia. So time is a factor. If Britain is going to win the war, they have to win it very quickly before the French arrive. And so they decide to invade Virginia in kind of a last attempt to end the war quickly. Which leads us to the final battle of the Revolution. General Cornwallis and the British armies he commanded went to Yorktown, Virginia, and because there was a fort there. The American force initially caused Cornwallis to retreat, and then word reached George Washington in the north. And so George Washington raced his entire army south, along with a recently arrived force of 6,000 French troops. So basically, the entire Continental Army, along with some French troops, managed to corner and surround the largest remaining British army in the Americas. Then the French fleet arrived from the Caribbean in order to trap the British escape by sea from Georgetown. And so a large siege and bombardment began. I'm going to give you guys an idea of where Yorktown is. As you can see, it's an area that is pretty easy to surround. And the French Navy is going to block their escape routes into the Atlantic Ocean. And so in October of 1781, American troops basically attack the fort at Yorktown, and they're going to surround them so that there's really no escape. There's nowhere for them to go. And after a lengthy bombardment, the combined forces of the Continental Army and the French are going to force the British to surrender over 8,000 men to George Washington. And so on October 19th of 1781, the war for American independence is essentially going to be over with this surrender. But why is the war really over? There's still 30,000 British troops in the United States, even after those 8,000 surrendered. And the king, George III, still very much wanted to continue the fight. But he's finally going to lose control of Parliament. The Peace Party, the politicians that wanted peace are finally going to get elected and take over, and they're going to try to end the war. The Prime Minister, a man by the name of Lord North, resigned, and finally the House of Commons, the body that was actually elected by the people in England, voted to end the war. So ultimately, the war becomes so unpopular in Britain that they pretty much decide that it is no longer worth fighting the new United States. So, at the end of the Revolution, peace negotiations begin in Europe. A couple people who were there, John Adams, Ben Franklin, and a man called John Jay, who would later be the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So finally in 1783, because these things take a long time to negotiate, the Treaty of Paris is signed. And in the Treaty of Paris, Britain finally recognized the United States as a new nation. So the United States had won what it wanted. And the British give generous terms to the United States. They give them the western lands, though that's going to create problems later because those lands belong to the natives. And also, Britain gives up all the rest of their colonial claims, and Spain and France, for their participation in the war, get some of their territory. So, British probably could have continued this war, but they gave the United States very generous terms even after deciding to end the war. And the reason why is because of the pound sterling. Parliament's main aim with peace with the United States is to reestablish commerce and trade. They see them as a potential major trading partner, just like things were before the war. So, even at the end of this war, the animosity doesn't prevent Britain from making the decision that is going to benefit both the United States and Great Britain. So at the end of this war, approximately 25,000 Americans have given their lives for independence. In Britain, about 20,000 soldiers have died, and about 7,500 German mercenaries have fallen in this conflict. These are relatively large numbers for the time, but the human cost of war always must be tallied. And 25,000 is a little bit bigger number when you remember that there's only 2 million Americans during this time. So at the end of the Revolution, the United States of America has won the right to build themselves a new nation. But it's going to have to decide what it's going to look like, what it's going to stand for, and how it's going to be governed. And this new nation is going to still emphasize the same freedoms and rights that they went to war for. The idea of due process, of religious and economic liberty, of self-rule and individual rights, and ultimately equality that would eventually be extended to all groups in the United States. And so, the United States of America is born, and the long history that we have discussed this year is now set to take place and create the country that we live in.